The Last of Us Part 1, developed by Naughty Dog, acts as a remake of the first game in the series with newly added features not seen in the original or remastered releases, complete with updated visuals. The Last of Us in general has achieved what very few video games have, and that's universal cult status in and outside of the gaming community itself. This is a once-in-a-generation game that's managed to reach a non-gaming audience and still earn the respect of the gaming community at large. It's a game that doesn't come around often, and has changed the way storytelling in video games is approached, having influenced a number of releases since 2013. The game has become so legendary in its status among pop culture that it's received a fairly decent TV adaptation that, within of its own right, was received well. Just going down the list of achievements The Last of Us has earned. The game received over 200 Game of the Year awards. It was remastered rather quickly within just 1 year of its initial release. The game spawned a sequel that, while mixed with the reception, was just as successful as the first game. The game received a remake within less than 10 years of its initial release. The game spawned a TV series that became a cult hit. And overall, the game is considered by many to be one of the greatest video games of all time. But the question remains, why? If you ask randoms in the hardcore gaming community, those in the minority would parrot the same tired talking points. The Last of Us is a movie game. The Last of Us is slow. The Last of Us has weak gameplay. The Last of Us has ridiculous platforming. On and on and on and on. Well, having replayed the game recently for the first time on PC, I've reanalyzed just why this game works so well and why it became the cult hit that it is. The Last of Us flawlessly nails certain things that most video games don't, either through failure or just not even attempting at all given the limitations of the medium itself. Specifically, there's 3 things that this game does extremely well. The first is obvious. The Last of Us is extremely well written.
Well, better than nothing. Oh, I'm sure your friend will be missing this tonight. It's light on the reading, but it's got some interesting photos.
Ellie, that ain't for kids.
Whoa! How the hell would he even walk around with that thing?
Get rid of that.
Well, hold your horses. I want to see what all the fuss is about. Oh, why are these all stuck together? I'm just fucking with you. Bye-bye, dude.
It's one of the greatest stories told in the medium of video games. One could argue that it's not the best, but such an argument would be redundant. Whether or not The Last of Us is the GOAT when it comes to storytelling in gaming is irrelevant because it consistently makes the list every time the question is raised, what are the best stories told in the medium? When you think of the best narratives in gaming, when you think of the best written video games, there's a few key titles that come to mind. The Mass Effect trilogy, the original Halo trilogy, the original Gears of War trilogy, Persona 5, Resident Evil 7, the original God of War trilogy, BioShock, Batman Arkham Asylum, Batman Arkham City, Kingdom Hearts 2, Final Fantasy 6, Final Fantasy 7, Final Fantasy 12, Red Dead Redemption 2, Grand Theft Auto 5, Wolfenstein The New Order, Wolfenstein 2, Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic, Half-Life 1, Half-Life 2, The Witcher 3, Ghost of Tsushima, Gone Home, Inside, Metal Gear Solid 1 through 4, The Last of Us. The Last of Us is well within its right to be included on this list when it comes to narrative storytelling. But again, why? There's a few reasons. The first being the core story itself is very strong. The Last of Us takes place within an apocalyptic world that's gone to ruin where a fungal outbreak has devastated humanity, leaving legions of infected, blood-hungry monsters left to populate the world, where many of the human survivors are transformed into the worst of humankind. A man named Joel, who suffers the loss of his daughter at the start of the game, becomes one of these not-so-moral hardened survivors over many years of not having a purpose, a reason to keep fighting. Eventually, he's given a job to transport cargo in the form of a teenage girl, Ellie, who just so happens to be immune to the spores that has caused the outbreak infecting the world. Ellie and Joel, over time, form an unbreakable bond, becoming a surrogate parent-child relationship that drives the game's entire plot. The reason this works so well is that the game gives the player a reason to give a shit. Most video games, including some of the most well-known games, fail to give the player any reason to care about why they're pressing buttons on the controller. Not only does The Last of Us give the player a reason to care, but it subverts this notion even further by placing the reason directly in front of your face throughout nearly the entire game. Ellie is the reason why this journey is worth the trouble. She represents the ultimate goal throughout the entire span of the runtime. Without Ellie, the game's story falls apart immediately because Joel no longer has anything to fight for. This is why The Last of Us has one of the greatest intros in all of gaming, because the death of Joel's daughter is also the loss of his sole purpose in life, whereas when he meets Ellie 2 decades later, his purpose is slowly restored as the two form a relationship. The Last of Us gives the player a reason to care, but that's only part of it. The second reason for why The Last of Us story works is due to the side characters. Tess, Bill, Sam and Henry, Tommy, Riley, and even David and Marlene. These characters represent different themes of loyalty, tragedy, savagery, and betrayal. Each is given appropriate dialogue which boosts the growth of the main characters Joel and Ellie. Again, very few video games manage to carve out side characters that are just as well written as the primary protagonist, but The Last of Us does so again flawlessly.
You ain't gonna make it. Here.
What's this?
You'd be amazed at how many cars still got gas in them.
Appreciate it. Look, Bill, about your buddy back there, that's a tough deal. And
We square.
we're square.
And get the fuck out of my town.
The third reason for why the story in The Last of Us is efficient is the pacing. The game is appropriately paced to where the player never stays in one location for an extended period of time, and it's balanced out by 4 seasons of the year, starting with summer and ending with spring. This is something that not even The Last of Us Part 2 gets right. Where that game overstayed its welcome with the runtime, failing to introduce new locations at a reasonable pace, the first game excels at this every step of the way. The story, as great as it is, stands as only one reason why The Last of Us is such a beloved icon in the gaming medium. Another reason why the game works is the art direction. To this day, The Last of Us has some of the best art direction I've ever seen in a video game. It also has a broad range of locales spread nicely throughout. Abandoned city ruins, blown out hotels, booby-trapped ghost towns, eerily silent college dorms filled with infected, snow-covered resorts full of cannibalistic maniacs, underground tunnels overtaken with vegetation, hospital rooms under the guise of dusk full of armed rebels. The Last of Us has it all. The game consistently presents the player with highly intriguing new locations, each with their own unique threat from the start of the game to the end. And the graphical design of the game is so strong that it actually looks spot on with the game's rather exceptional concept art, something that not every game pulls off proficiently. Not only is the story great and the art direction is dynamic, but The Last of Us has some of the best enemy design ever developed in a video game. This also ties in with the gameplay. One of the main criticisms of The Last of Us is how the gameplay is nothing special. It's a rather limited third-person shooter with a crafting mechanic. Of course, this is a rather ignorant and rather straightforward view of the game's core systems. The enemies in The Last of Us are what make the game very engaging to play. They force you to pay attention to everything, especially if you don't or can't use the listening mechanic. With the non-infected human enemies, they're very menacing because, like Joel, they are just as savage and will do anything to survive. They also coordinate with each other, and if you take out just one with loud bravado, they all will converge on your location, which is not good in your favor. This forces the player to utilize stealth to strategically take out threats in the environment without getting caught. This is where The Last of Us shines gameplay-wise because it relies on the player's ability to use stealth and distractions to fight their way through the various combat encounters that the game throws at them instead of sheer gunfire via brute force. The game is more rewarding on higher difficulties where ammo becomes virtually non-existent, forcing you to rely entirely on stealth. This is where the game changes considerably in how it plays. The human enemies also deliver banter that alerts you to what they're thinking as they're roaming the environment. If you manage to stun one of the human survivors, what happens is one of the greatest implementations in a video game when it comes to enemy design. The stunned enemy will beg for their life as you stand in complete control of their fate with no other option but to take their life in the most brutal fashion.
Let's just be cool, man. Take it easy.
Holy shit, Joel.
This creates a moral crutch on the player that most video games don't even attempt or fail at creating. It's a reminder that the survivors are human just like you, but it's either them or you. That's just the human enemies. Then you have the infected, or the zombies. The infected in The Last of Us again represents some of the best enemy design seen in a video game. Appearing in different forms based on the stages of infection tied to the game's lore, you have runners, which are in the early stages of infection. These enemies will bum rush the player if they're seen. They're dangerous in numbers and will often appear in numbers when encountered, again forcing the player to utilize stealth to deal with them. You have stalkers, which are in the second stage of infection. These enemies, as the name implies, will stalk the player, appearing in dark areas where there is limited or no light to give away their position. These enemies help to emphasize the horror element of the game.
Oh, fuck. Stalkers.
Next, you have what's easily one of the most recognizable enemies in gaming, the terrifying clickers, named for the loud clicking sound they make. With a chilling design where a large fungus has grown out of the eyes and mouth, taking over the entire face of the victim, these enemies are a death sentence, with their one attack being a near inescapable grapple that's a one-hit kill. To make it even harder, the clickers have intense, sensitive hearing like a deer, and will pounce on the player's position if they detect you're there. The one advantage the player has over these monstrosities is that they're blind due to the fungus infection covering their faces. This forces the player to solely use stealth when clickers are present. They're extremely powerful and dangerous in numbers. Gameplay-wise, when clickers are paired with other enemy types that can see the player, that's when things get interesting.
Infected.
Looks like there's a path down this hall.
Will, I need your help with this door. I gotta kill these guys first.
That was fucking close.
You have the more rare bloaters, which are several stages into infection. These massive zombies are more powerful than previous stages of infection and can take a serious degree of gunfire before falling in combat. They also have the clicker's sense of hearing and will converge on you as soon as they detect your presence. They also have a one-hit kill grapple that, unlike the clicker, can't be countered with a shiv. They release spores and can throw fungal spores at you. Bloaters are also fast, so you must take them out at a safe distance and quickly with either ammunition or tools such as Molotovs. The one advantage that the player has over them is that they're weak to fire. This balances out the bloaters on a scale of power versus the player's capabilities. Each enemy in The Last of Us reflects the brutal rule of the game's setting. It's survival of the fittest from start to finish. Not just in the gameplay that's presented, but also in various moments where Joel would have died without Ellie's assistance, and vice versa. The enemy design boosts the storytelling and gameplay to create a well-rounded experience. Combine this with the crafting and upgrade systems along with the limited ammunition reserves and higher difficulty settings, and you have one hell of a survival theme that remains constant in the game design. Something most critics of the game fail to recognize for one reason or another.
You're welcome.
About the only criticism of this game that's valid would be the platforming, which at this point is definitely outdated. Everything else that's been implemented has aged appropriately, including the brilliant score from composer Gustavo Santaolalla, who makes use of very clever acoustic guitar and percussion tracks. The Last of Us has one of the greatest original soundtracks from any video game in the medium, as it's instantly recognizable, very laid back for a game that takes place within an apocalyptic setting. Not only is the main game fantastic, but the multiplayer was in a league of its own. To this day, the multiplayer from The Last of Us is one of the best that I've played. It takes the critical element of stealth and emphasizes it, making it the sole purpose of the gameplay, pitting two teams against each other in surprisingly highly tactical death matches. Unfortunately, the multiplayer was not ported over to the remake version of the game. The multiplayer in The Last of Us hasn't truly been replicated since, which is why Naughty Dog is making a standalone multiplayer game to bring that experience back to players who appreciated the design of the game's multiplayer mode, which was also missing in The Last of Us Part 2. So, everything in The Last of Us is great. The story is one of the best ever written in the gaming industry. The stealth gameplay is engaging and fun. The enemy design is some of the best seen in a video game. The soundtrack is amazing. The side characters are three-dimensional. The DLC, which explores a portion of Ellie's backstory and adds to the main game simultaneously, is one of the best supplemental content that's been offered in the last decade. But what else could possibly elevate this game any higher? What is the one component that makes The Last of Us stand out over other video games? The secret ingredient that The Last of Us has over other video games is the depiction of violence.
Busy couple of days, huh?
Whatever, man. Damn, no food, old pair of shoes. We got nothing. Let's go.
Man,
Ain't nothing we could have done.
I know. It's just... Oh, man.
The Last of Us is a very violent video game, but even though it's not the most gory title in the history of gaming, it's very honest and provides gritty realism when it comes to the violence that's depicted on screen. That's ultimately what makes it stand out from all its contemporaries. That is why this series has garnered such a massive audience. If you look at other violent and gory video games, Blood Rain, Mortal Kombat, the Souls games, the Resident Evil games, the earlier God of War games, the Grand Theft Auto games, so on and so forth, if you look at the violence in these games, the violence that's depicted works within the presentation of the game itself, but it's exaggerated to the extreme, to the point of sheer silliness. The fatalities of the Mortal Kombat games, for example, are so over the top that one can tell the developers have designed them to purposely implement a tone of comedy, specifically black comedy. You're supposed to laugh at how ridiculous they are, despite how violent they come across. The same can be said for the Grand Theft Auto games, where the violence itself is a satire on violence itself within American society. But it's not truly gory, nor does it accurately depict violence in real life. Violence within the Souls games and the earlier God of War games is depicted in different ways, the former being an emphasis on just how weak the player truly is, and the latter being a pure power fantasy like most video games. Violence within the Resident Evil games is gruesome at times, but it's not realistic by any stretch of the imagination, nor is it intended to come off that way. Violence in The Last of Us is depicted in such a way that it makes what you're doing to specifically the human enemies uncomfortable. It's a core intended part of the game's design, which is to make the player feel something. When you shoot an enemy in the head in other video games, the character's sprite sprays some blood and their ragdoll body falls to the floor. There's no bullet hole, there's no entry or exit wound. You may have a decapitation like in Resident Evil or Gears of War, but again, it's the kind of violence that's exaggerated. When you shoot someone in the face in The Last of Us, you can see a realistic entrance wound. Their face has either been blown off or the bullet hole has been left in their skull as blood seeps from the wound, creating a puddle around the head. When you engage in hand-to-hand combat, the camera zooms in to the point of contact as you and your opponent trade vicious blows. NPCs react with believable dialogue when you land a bullet on their body. The level of violence depicted here is not something that's common in video games. In fact, it's something that's only truly common in The Last of Us. That shows that The Last of Us has something more to say about violence and how we view it in the real world versus just seeing a digital depiction of it in a computer game. It's very much arguable that The Last of Us is the most violent video game franchise ever created because the violence that's depicted is real. Don't believe me? Just look at the final encounter between Ellie and Abby in The Last of Us Part 2. Say what you will about the storytelling of how these two characters got there. The violence depicted in that fight is on a different playing field. Still don't believe me? Look at the YouTuber reactions to moments from that game and tell me The Last of Us doesn't have the most realistic depiction of violence ever showcased in a video game.
Stop! She had nothing to do with it. She's pregnant. Good. Abby!
This fucking...
Stop! She had nothing to do with it. She's pregnant. Good. Abby.
Yes, Dana! Careful, Dina, you're pregnant! No! Lev, God.
Stop! She had nothing to do with it. She's pregnant. Good. Abby. Stop! She had nothing to do with it. She's pregnant. Good. Abby. Good. Abby. Joel, fucking get up. Please stop. Please don't shoot. Joel, please get up. No! Get up. Joel, please get up.
Oh my God, it's got brain on the...
Joel, please get up.
Oh, this fucking bitch, dude. Oh my God.
Oh my gosh. Oh my gosh. Yo, golly. This is a different type of boss battle, bro.
Just hold her down. Oh, what the? Dude, what the fuck?
Mortal Kombat may be the goriest game series, but The Last of Us is the most believable violent game ever made. Yet, despite all this, the theme of the first game is one of love. Love between a hardened man who's lost everything and a young girl who has also lost everything. It's a universal theme that anyone who is actually paying attention can appreciate. Now we're seeing more games with more realistic depictions of violence, including the newer God of War games, which have a toned-down level of violence compared to the older entries, and the upcoming Final Fantasy XVI, which has a Game of Thrones influence with its depiction of violence. The change in tone for these respective franchises wouldn't exist if The Last of Us didn't pave the way in showing what violence can look like in a video game outside of just the typical power fantasy. The Last of Us has withstood the test of time, despite all the criticisms pointed at the game in the years since the original 2013 release. It's a game that truly stands on its own and has earned the attention of audiences young and old. It's a relic of its time that's still relevant now as it was well over a decade ago. Now, whether or not a remake that adds virtually nothing of importance or value to the original game was warranted, or the fact that the terrible PC port that somehow still has players downloading shaders over a month after its controversial release, making it the worst PlayStation PC port to date, is up for debate. But one thing is certain. The Last of Us is indeed one of the greatest releases in the medium of video games. And it will be remembered for a long time to come.
I swear.
Okay.